Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 720 for the 24th of July, 2022. Lots of twos in there. Richard Saunders coming to you from wet, soggy, wet, soggy and soggy Sydney, Australia. Coming up on this week's show, we're going to kick off with an interview I did a few days ago with Melanie Tresick King in Massachusetts. And she's a woman after my own heart because she's a science educator who uses interesting notions like cold reading and so forth to help educate her students about science. She wrote an article for the Australian Skeptics magazine, or published in the Australian Skeptics magazine, about science and pseudoscience and science denialism. We talk about that. But really, I was quite amazed how much we have in common when it comes to science education and science outreach. I'm sure you'll enjoy this interview coming up at the top of the show. Following that, it's the return of the Book of Tim with Tim Mendham. And this week, Tim will start the first part of a two-part series about Perpetual Motion. And it's called Neverending Story, written by Dr. Anthony Garrett, but it is originally from the Skeptic magazine, Volume 7, Number 4, way back in 1987. But needless to say, when it comes to Perpetual Motion, well, not much has changed. Part 1 this week, Part 2 next week, or the week after. Then to round off the show, it's back to the Trove archives. And this week we're going to be looking into alien abductions. Included is a song. Yes, there's a song about alien abductions I discovered when I was researching this story.
Came out and took him inside. They looked him over with one big eye.
Thank you to those people who've written to me expressing their sadness at the passing of our voiceover man, Jim Wilshire, just last week. There's been a week for me of lots of memories, going through the archives and finding lots of work Jim and I did together. A great loss here at the Skeptic Zone, and of course, as I said last week, a great loss to his family, goes without saying, his friends, and his many, many fans in Radio Land over the decades. Next week, I hope to bring you a bit of a better tribute to Jim, including some of his skeptical poetry. So no matter where you're listening to this, even if you're busy, are you very busy at the moment? Do you listen to podcasts when you're rushing around trying to do one thing after another? Maybe you're in the car driving somewhere, busily being busy and sparing a bit of time to be entertained, I hope, by the Skeptic Zone. But no matter where you are, I'm glad you are listening. Now it's time for me to run downstairs. Where are those cats? Where are the Skeptic Zone cats? I think they're downstairs by the heater. I'm going to run downstairs. And why don't I have a nice cheese toastie? With a little bit of horseradish. Oh boy. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. Folks, right in front of me, I've got a copy of the very latest Skeptic magazine, the journal from Australian Skeptics. I recommend you subscribe. And I was flipping through, and early on page 14, in fact, there's a very fascinating report, Science and Its Pretenders. And this is an article by Melanie Tresick King, and joining me on the line from just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, is Melanie. Hello.
Hello. Lovely to see you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Not a problem. Yes, of course, it's the days of video conferencing and we can see each other as we're having a chat. I found this item very interesting, but before we get to the item, it's about science and pseudoscience. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background?
Yeah, so I'm actually a plant ecologist by training and teach at a community college in Massachusetts. And our community college system, I don't know if you're familiar with, but they're 2-year colleges. And so we have a lot of students who get their credits and then transfer on to a 4-year. And I have for a long time taught the general biology course that most people take when they need to get a degree. And it's intro bio for non-majors. And I grew really tired of teaching that course because I kind of felt like I was just getting them to memorize a bunch of stuff and then they were going to forget it after the exam. And they were really going to hate science even more than they started when they took the course. So I actually completely canned the course and started all over again from scratch with my idea of what I thought people needed to know about how science works for the rest of their life. Like if I have 4 months for the average person, what would that look like? And the article you have in front of you is part of that. I use pseudoscience and science denial in the class to teach what science looks like.
Well, this is very interesting. And I read this article with great interest because it does cover a lot of issues that we face in skepticism. That is, a lot of people, well, to be blunt and for lack of a better word, maybe are ignorant as to the method of science and what science means and how it works exactly. There's a handy little chart. Actually, I think it was on, as I crash about here, I think it was on page 15. Yes, there it is. Contrasting science follows the evidence, for example, to conclusion, against pseudoscience and science denial. Now, what is the difference there? We've heard of people practicing pseudoscience like homeopathy and whatever, and then there's science denial. But there's a big crossover there, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, this was sort of my attempt to simplify what I viewed as the 2 different ways of viewing the things that aren't science. And for me, they really come down to, so if science is a system of objectively gathering and evaluating evidence as a community to try to come to the best representation of what reality is. Science is pretenders. The pseudoscience and science denial are the misuse of science because of different motivated reasoning, either a wanting to believe something or a not wanting to believe it. So, I mean, nobody's anti-science until it conflicts with their beliefs, right? The old saying goes. So when something is what we want to believe, then our standard of evidence drops. And when we don't want to believe because of vested interests or identity issues, whatever it is, our standard of evidence shoots through the roof and it gets impossibly high. But all of that stems from the same basic psychological underpinning, which is the motivation to not want to accept science in some way.
That's very interesting. Now, one of the points that I've marked here on my notes when reading your article, and I find it a fascinating thing when it comes to science denialism, is what you just sort of said then, impossibly high standards. Impossibly high standards. It's like the people who demand of a skeptical approach things that we can't possibly meet, their expectations. I'm just trying to find a good example of impossibly high standards.
Yeah, I mean, so these days I spend an awful lot of time on social media where I kind of get to view people's how people want to have discussions about these concepts. And you can see it in practice. And when somebody doesn't want to believe something, they'll say something like, well, science hasn't proven it to be true.
Right.
It's not a fact. When science has proven this, I'll accept it.
Right.
See it a lot around things like climate change, evolution, vaccines. So for me, this comes back to this old way of how we teach science. It drives me bonkers at this point. Whenever you see a science textbook, you open it up and the very first chapter is the scientific method.
Right.
And the scientific method is, right, you make an observation and then you develop a hypothesis and then you design an experiment. And then, at the end of this linear process, you did a science and then you have your answer. And science does not work that way, right? And the worst is for most of these textbooks, they never come back to what that process looks like in all of the facts that are presented in the textbook. So it's my idea that what happens is People learn that science is these things that we know, these facts that science has found out, when they don't understand that scientific explanations are always tentative.
Yeah.
We don't prove these things. So when you start to talk about uncertainties, which is how scientists talk, the public hears, especially if they don't want to accept it, well, they don't know, right? They don't know. They're always changing their mind, right? When they figure it out, then I'll believe them. But until then, it's just a theory.
But you're absolutely right. And this, the topic that crossed my mind is homeopathy, where I've heard people say to me, well, we know homeopathy works. We don't know how it works, but science has yet to catch up with us, which I think is a fascinating point of view.
Yeah. Yeah, homeopathy is its own special can of worms, right? And it certainly qualifies as a pseudoscience. What I think is interesting is that pseudoscience and science denial often dovetail. So the example I give in the article is evolution, just because it's so perfect. If you don't want to accept the science of evolution, then you get this whole field of science denial. And it looks like, with the fake experts, John Cook's Flick taxonomy with Mark Hoofnagel, the Flick. So fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. And you get all of that. But you have to have a belief to replace it. The science is wrong about this. So the pseudoscience of creationism pops up, right? And now instead of having possibly high standards of evidence, anything that we can find that fits with this of what we want to believe is considered proof of creationism.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, what can we say? We're all human. We're all going to look for the things that confirm our point of view to begin with. And I guess when it comes to the points you make in your article, it's and I get back to my original point, there is a certain, especially in the general population, and maybe understandably so, a certain ignorance about exactly what science is and how it works. And again, the point you make, when science says, no, we can't prove this to the nth degree, or this is our tentative conclusion, the opponents of science will look at that as, oh, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Science is wrong. It's always changing. Therefore, my point of view is correct. And we get back to creationism or homeopathy again.
Yeah. And homeopathy, you said something really interesting in there. So with pseudosciences, again, the standard of evidence is very low. And one of the, especially in alternative medicine, the anecdote or the personal experience is considered just airtight evidence. So I tried it and it worked. How do I know homeopathy worked? Well, it worked for me. And so this understanding of the limits of our perceptions to accurately form us, like how biased we are, and then therefore why, if we want to figure out if homeopathy works, well, we have to not use personal experiences. We designed randomized control trials with double blinding to reduce all those biases. They can interfere with our conclusions. But it's very hard, I've noticed, to get people to understand that their experiences aren't necessarily airtight ways of knowing. With my class, I hope my students aren't listening, but on day one of my class, I fooled my students. Right. So are you familiar with Bertrand Four's experiments? So he's the Four effect or the Barnum effect.
Yes. Very famous.
Yeah. So he has this great experiment with the psychology students. He gave them all personality assessments, and he asked them how accurate they were, on a scale of 1 to 5, and most of them were about 4.3 to 4.5 out of 5. And they all got the same one.
Yes.
So I do that with my students. I go through this whole ruse of I have this friend who's an astrologer and she's very famous. I'm not going to tell you who she is yet, but she knows I'm skeptical. So the whole thing, it turns out I'm a really good liar when I want to. So I then give my students this and then this is so accurate. How did she know me? And then they realize they all got the same one. And my point is I could tell you, I could fool you, but you wouldn't necessarily believe me. You wouldn't take that lesson to heart. So I'm going to fool you to show you that you can be fooled. Now you can't necessarily trust yourself or me, apparently. So how can we find a better way of going?
I'm glad you do that, because just as a matter of maybe coincidence, or well, hardly a coincidence, that I've been doing a science show for school groups now for 16 years or something like that. And one of the items we do is the astrology test. We hand out their astrology. It's all the same. And this was given to me by James Randi, this test, because he did it on a TV show many, many, many years ago. So I know exactly what you mean. And it's a great lesson. It really is a great lesson. But all these sort of topics, folks, are covered in the article. I sincerely suggest you subscribe to the Skeptic magazine. You can read this article for yourself at skeptics.com.au. There's a handy table there. There's much more in it. Now, Melanie, I know, I happen to know, from inside information that your great passion is not only science communication, but education. Now, can you flesh that out a bit more for me?
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, one of the big things that I think is effective is using pseudoscience and science denial in class. So Carl Sagan has this great quote, and I'm going to paraphrase, but if we teach people only the findings of science without the method of science, then how are they going to know the difference between science and pseudoscience? And so I literally took him literally and thought, well, what if I just use pseudoscience? So we cover homeopathy and astrology and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and so many wonderful different forms of pseudoscience and science denial. I think too many students leave a science class, again, with this idea that science is a bunch of facts. Mm-hmm. But in the real world, there's so many claims that they come face to face with. And what I'm trying to do is get them to understand the world around them and the kinds of things that they're going to see. And people believe in pseudoscience, right? People don't trust science sometimes. And so I use that in class. And I think it's very effective.
You know what? Again, this is quite remarkable because this is exactly the philosophy I've had with this show. It's called The Mystery Investigators. And we use these wonderfully interesting claims for students. We say, here's the claim. This is what it looks like. Let's see if we can investigate it. And the classic experiment we've been doing for many years is water divining or water dowsing, where we have a line of 10 tubs, upside down plastic tubs at the front of the lecture theatre or the classroom, and one tub will have a little bottle of water hidden underneath. And we give the students divining rods and they all walk along and they see if they can find the water. Then we talk about double-blind tests and statistics and stuff. And I found that being really effective because they're having a lot of fun and they're doing something really strange and at the same time learning about the scientific method. And yes, I use one of the great gifts of all is a 10-sided die for randomization because the kids love it.
Of course they do.
So I see you and I share quite a similar passion when it comes to science education.
Oh, gosh, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think about all the students I had over the years that I was teaching the old way. And I honestly feel like I failed them a little bit. Part of me feels really bad. I'm hoping that it led me to a better place. One of the other things that I think is really helpful is I use what's called inoculation theory. Mm-hmm. Which is, so it's the idea of like vaccines, but for the mind and misinformation. So if we expose people to bits of misinformation in a controlled environment, then they learn to spot it in the real world. I teach my students how to cold read, like a psychic. Wow. Right?
Yes.
So that when they see a psychic, John Edwards standing in front of an audience going, I'm getting a G, father, uncle, grandfather, right? They can see that because I've taught them how to cold read. I teach them how to make conspiracy theories. I teach them, they make advertisements for health pseudoscience products. Wow. Because once you make those and you see, well, it's all natural, ancient, healing from nature's wisdom, that I tried it and I liked it, and look at this person in a lab coat and they say it works, then you can see it because they're all the same.
I think, I think I'm going to have to make a special trip to visit one of your classes because it's just ringing so many bells with me. But let me just reach over to my bookcase here. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It's called The Full Facts Book of Cold Reading.
Okay.
And you quickly write it down because it is the reference for cold reading. It's by a friend of mine called Ian Rowland. It's been out for some years, but I learnt so much from that. You have no idea. It's a marvelous book.
Oh, amazing. Well, I don't get that in depth with it, but I'm definitely checking out that book. And I'm in Massachusetts. You're welcome to come by my classroom anytime.
It's a long way to go, but that's okay. I would dearly love to see it because it does sound like you and I have been doing very similar things. Very similar things. And while you're there, and I hope it's still online, you can see my water divining test. If you Google my name plus water divining, it should come up. I did a demonstration at the amazing meeting in Las Vegas many years ago, which was videoed, and it's specifically made for teachers. Wow, Melanie, we will have to catch up one day in person. We can swap notes and have a lot of fun. But it's been a pleasure to talk with you. And again, folks, Melanie's report is in the latest issue of the Skeptic magazine from Australian Skeptics, and you can get that at skeptics.com.au. And do you have a website people can visit?
Oh, yes, please. The website is Thinking is Power. So not necessarily just knowledge is power, but thinkingispower.com. I put a lot of curriculum ideas there, actually. The foundations of my course are on the website. And I'm also on Facebook and Twitter at Thinking Powers.
Folks, I will link to that URL in this week's show notes. But for now, Melanie Treesick-King, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Dunning, executive producer of Science Friction, now on streaming services. I wanted to let you know about my next feature documentary film. It's called The UFO Movie They Don't Want You to See, and it's a science-based look at this whole modern UFO phenomenon. What don't we know? What do we know? And how do we know it? We're going to speak with pilots, physicists, image analysts, and, uniquely, experts in optical illusions, and give the audience a good understanding of what's actually in all these UFO videos. Come and watch the trailer, and if you like, help produce the film. Visit theufo.movie to see it. That's theufo.movie. Join me and let's make this film a real resource that does the world some good for a change. theufo.movie. I'm Brian Dunning. Thank you.
And now, a reading from the Book of Tim with Tim Mendham.
Hi, my name's Tim Mendham. I'm Executive Officer of Australian Skeptics Inc. and editor of our magazine, The Skeptic. And today's article comes from the September 2016 issue of the magazine, which is volume 36, number 3, but more importantly, it is a reprint of one that goes back to the dim, dark, distant age of the Skeptic's first decade. It was published in September 1987. It's volume 7, number 4. This is an article called Neverending Story, and it's written by Anthony Garrett, who used to be a member of Australian Skeptics Committee in Sydney, and he was a researcher in physics at Sydney University. And it's about perpetuum mobile, better known as perpetual motion. And what I'm reading now is part 1, which will look at the nature of perpetual motion and what people claimed it to be, etc. And next week, I'll be reading part 2, which is the history of perpetual motion. Now let's look at part 1. There is a considerable grey area between science and pseudoscience. Skeptical organisations exist to combat the latter and to encourage the critical mode of thought employed by the former. Often the distinction is clear-cut. Astronomy is clearly a science, for example, and astrology clearly a pseudoscience. Internal consistency is the most valuable criterion for distinguishing between the two. A new idea in astronomy, if it conflicts with the old ideas, must either be rejected or, less often, must cause sufficient revision to the old ideas to permit its incorporation without contradiction. Astrology, by contrast, is a mess of ad hoc ideas which are often in mutual contradiction. Predictions of tropical and sidereal astrology stand in open conflict, and one system cannot even predict anything at all for those people born north of the Arctic Circle. Nobody thought to warn the Eskimos of this peril, and no harm has befallen them as a result. Astrology, though, was once in the mainstream of science, even though scientists today would not use that word to describe the efforts of their forebears. To paraphrase the poet William Blake, knowledge itself will not be the same when we know more. Perhaps the birth of what we call the scientific mode of thought was a one-off revolution for all time. Perhaps today's science will not merely be outdated, but transcended. There are no signs of this yet, New Age ideals notwithstanding. In this article, Anthony shall examine another endeavour which was once mainstream science, and moreover, science in today's sense of the word, perpetual motion. The appeal is immediate to anyone who has seen Escher's marvellous visual pun arising from the projection of 3 dimensions onto 2, in which water cascades down over a water wheel and then returns by gravity to its starting point. Perpetual motion was a hot topic in the 19th century, both for theoretical reasons, could energy be created from nowhere, and for practical reasons, because the age of the engineer was at its height. Since the idea is analysable from the standpoint of modern science, it is in this realm that the answers should be sought. The criterion of internal consistency, which serves as a weapon against more complicated schools of thought external to science, is not needed. Yet perpetual motion still stands as a grey area. Some of its proponents are clear-cut cranks, some simply lacking in scientific education. I have personally encountered both types, Anthony says. For the first type, it is all a crazy hobby, but for the second, a good deal of time, money and even lives are needlessly wasted. Let this serve as a warning to those who doubt that scientific literacy is the currency of our age. Even 100 years ago, the US Navy came close to espousing the cause of one particular machine. And the reason why perpetual motion still remains popular, over a century after the idea was definitively laid to rest, is of course the dream of conjuring energy out of nothing, which is just as pertinent, if more so today than it was in 1987. Were this feasible, all the coal-fired power stations with their sulphurous emissions could be closed. Likewise, nuclear fission power plants with their radioactive waste, natural power sources with their supposed threat of covering the world's deserts and mountains with solar cells and windmills could be dropped. The huge funds expended on energy research redeployed, and cheap energy made readily available to developing countries. Not a bad list of achievements for a humble machine. Now let's look at the types of perpetual motion. Perpetual motion proposals are of 2 types, and the distinction is crucial. A perpetual motion machine of the first kind actually creates energy. Some of this is inevitably rendered inaccessible through losses due to friction in the bearings of the machine or air drag against the moving parts or whatever. The rest is available to the world as free energy. A perpetual motion machine of the second kind, by contrast, does not create or destroy energy. It runs forever by completely eliminating friction in the bearings, air resistance and such. However, any attempt to extract energy from it causes it to slow down. These 2 types of machine run counter to the first and second laws of thermodynamics, respectively. First law, energy is conserved. Second law, entropy increases. Most perpetual motion machines proposed nowadays are of the first glory kind. Their proponents invariably agree with scientists as to the laws of force and torque operating within their machines. These laws were first elucidated by Isaac Newton 3 centuries ago and state that force equals mass times acceleration, torque equals moment of inertia times angular acceleration. The reason for the law's ready acceptance is that one's intuition is schooled in them. Once it is accepted that undisturbed motion is a body's natural state, that it alters its velocity only when a force is acting upon it, and that slowing down is not the natural state but the result of frictional forces, the path to Newton's law is easy. It nevertheless took a genius of Newton's stature to comprehend this for the first time. But crucially, the same people do not accept that the force laws also imply conservation of energy. This consequence is a fact. Scientists call it a first integral of Newton's laws. But it is one step further removed from the forces and torques which people can feel, and so is often beyond untutored intuition. I'm invariably told with a "don't blind me with science" look, "That's as may be, but what is wrong with my machine?" As a working scientist with a responsibility to my employer, I am placed in a quandary when asked by a well-meaning perpetual motion advocate to examine the design for a particular machine. Together with the inevitable discussion, it can take many hours. Because it is an easy matter to produce a machine with an obvious acceleration mechanism but a subtle deceleration process, the permutations are endless. Even more subtle are those machines which interchange energy between its various manifestations: motion, work against gravity, heat, latent energy of evaporation, the drinking bird, electromagnetism, and so on. Some of the subtleties are quite ingenious, but if Newton's laws are operating as they have been understood for 3 centuries, the catch is inevitably there somewhere. One particular catch occurs so frequently that it is worth special mention. Perpetual motion machines, in common with many others, are almost invariably cyclic. After sufficient operation, referred to as a cycle, the machine has returned to its initial configuration. A wheel making one complete turn and an internal combustion engine are examples of cyclic machines. Cyclicity is a matter of convenience, since a non-cyclic machine will be difficult to exploit. Often, proposed perpetual motion machines have an obvious acceleration mechanism in one part of the cycle, while the deceleration occurs in a separate part. It is essential to consider the energy balance over a complete cycle. Perpetual motion machines of the second kind, though less commercially attractive, are no less interesting. Moreover, they exist. The circumstances for their observation are very special, however, and cannot be duplicated in the household, as we shall see, unless one has a very exceptional fridge indeed. It will not have escaped the alert listener's notice that, from Newton's laws, an isolated body with no forces or torque acting upon it exhibits precisely perpetual motion of the second type. The problem is to reduce the force and torque to 0. A top may spin for 5 minutes until friction at the point and air resistance cause it to fail. Place it in an evacuated container to eliminate air resistance and it will run for longer. Sharpen the point of contact and it will run for longer still. But eventually it will still run down in the absence of any external energy source. The starting energy has not been destroyed, for the system is isolated but converted into heat in the surrounding area and the point of contact. Since heat is kinetic or motional energy of the air molecules, we could still see motion if only our eyesight were good enough. The motion is therefore perpetual, although on a microscopic rather than an easily observable everyday macroscopic scale. The energy of the top has been degraded into heat. This degradation process translates into physics as the second law of thermodynamics. It is a consequence of our inability to see on the atomic scale, rather than a law relating to the fundamental dynamics of the system, and is therefore a law of an altogether different kind from the first. Heat is inaccessible as an energy source, although energy can be extracted from bodies of differing temperatures, since one would have to know the differing directions of motion of all those million molecules in order to extract the energy. It is not surprising that there is an intimate relation between information and entropy, the quantity relating to the second law of thermodynamics. Now, other perpetual motion machines of the second kind owe their explanation to quantum theory, the revolutionary post-Newtonian picture of nature on the subatomic scale worked out in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. One example is the humble electron peacefully orbiting an atomic nucleus. Obviously, there is no air resistance. Air itself consists of atoms, and we are now looking within the atom. Because of the peculiarities of quantum theory, one can no longer view the electron as a tiny cricket ball going round a larger one, but the criterion for a perpetual motion machine of the second type is still satisfied, namely, the description of the system does not alter with time unless it is perturbed from the outside. The system does not run down. It might be argued that this is cheating. We can't see this electron, and even if we could, the act of seeing it involving bombarding it with photons would alter its state. However, we have now learned how to set up an easily determined quantum state of arbitrary extent. The secret is to cool the system sufficiently close to absolute zero. The phenomenon of superconductivity, in which an electric current circulates in a chilled wire with zero resistance, not just a very small resistance but truly zero, is an example. Superconducting materials have been found which lose all their electrical resistance at far higher temperatures than any known before, though still colder than the coldest fridge, and indeed at higher temperatures than was thought possible. Admittedly, you can't see an electric current, but its associated magnetic field is directly observable. Then there is superfluidity, in which a supercooled liquid will flow up the inside of a tube immersed in it and back down the outside indefinitely. These examples undeniably constitute perpetual motion of the second kind. They violate the second law of thermodynamics because ultimately that is not a law at all but a heuristic. As was stated, one needs to possess complete information pertaining to a system in order to extract all the thermal energy. And the second law merely states in effect that it is impossible in practice to obtain information on those millions of particles. It's not impossible in principle, and if the system consists of a single electron or a single superconducting quantum state, it is an easy matter. But finally, as far as the theory of perpetual motion is concerned, energy conservation still holds in Einstein's relativity theory, provided that mass m is seen as a further form of energy E, related in theory by the famous equation E equals mc squared, and in practice in nuclear reactors. And that, in spite of the statistical nature of quantum mechanics, energy conservation still holds exactly in the quantum picture. Now that's the end of part one of this presentation, and it's pretty heavy, I know. There's a lot of physics involved there, but it's important background for part two, which we'll look at next week. And this article on perpetual motion appeared in the Skeptic magazine, September 2016, which is volume 36, number 3. And as I said, it's a reprint of an article that originally appeared in the 1980s. And you can download it. You can download both versions if you like, and for free from our website, skeptics.com.au. And I look forward to talking to you and continuing the story next week.
Drinking, hey, oh, drinks, hey.
So nice to be back at Skeptics in the pub.
Yes, Richard, it's great that COVID-19 is a thing of the past and we can gather together and not wear masks, although I will occasionally, in special situations, you know what I mean, don't you?
This beer tastes better than I remember. And this beer glass is much bigger than I remember. Oh, thanks for this. I'll get the next round.
No need. All the beer is free tonight.
Free? Oh, wow.
Did you hear that all the anti-vaxxers and flat earthers have changed their minds?
What? Really?
Yeah. They're now busy writing apology letters to the whole world. They're really busy. They're going to have to sharpen their pencil, if you know what I mean.
Look. It's Lara coming over here with a plate full of food.
Hi, you two. Did you know that the food at the bar is free tonight? Anything you want.
Really?
You have to try the lobster and chips.
Lobster and chips? Oh, wow. This is like a dream.
And this pub now has recliner chairs, a free foot massage for everyone, and vouchers for Uber rides home.
Wow.
Hang on. This seems too good to be true. Who's the guest speaker? It's not bloody Brian Dunning, is it?
Let me see. This is odd. It says here it's the skeptical fairy godmother angel from the internet.
The skeptical godmother fairy in... You know, that sounds familiar.
Oh, wow. Smoking it up, woman.
Hello, everyone.
Who are you? What, you're only 10 centimetres tall. That's about 4 inches for those of you using the Darth Vader Imperial system. And floating in the air, that can't be right.
As Lara said, I'm the skeptical fairy godmother angel from the internet.
Ask a silly question.
And you're tonight's guest speaker?
Well, not really. I have come to tell you that, yes, this is all a dream.
I thought this was too good to be true.
I know we can't meet in pubs at the moment, but that shouldn't stop you from enjoying skeptical talks online. The Vic Skeptics have Skeptics Cafe each month. Sydney has Skeptics in the pub. There are online events from the Gold Coast and...
Yes. This all sounds eerily familiar. Have we met before somewhere?
Maybe we have. Maybe. It was as we watched a live and interactive skeptical talk. All you need do is search for them online, no matter where you are in the world.
She's right. I've been watching skeptical talks from the UK, the US, and even one from my own living room. Although that one wasn't very interesting. I fell asleep and I was the speaker.
Hang on. Weren't you once the Tooth Fairy?
I'll never live that down.
One last question.
Yes?
Just whose dream is this?
Mine. Goodbye.
Worse than sparklers.
She disappeared.
But, we're still here, huh?
Right. So, lobster and chips, anyone?
All right, now it's a dream you want to pay for everybody.
Once again to dive back into those wonderful archives, those digital archives from around the world in the segment we call Trove. We call this segment Trove because normally I'm looking at the Trove archives at trove.nla.gov.au, digitised newspapers, gazettes and so on, journals, magazines from Australian history, but quite frequently we look further afield, often to the United States. And this week we're going to look at a subject that I covered over a year ago now, but it's certainly akin to UFOs, which I cover frequently anyway. This is alien abductions. Have you ever been abducted by an alien? Have you abducted an alien? I wonder. We'll hear a couple of stories of people who claimed that they were indeed abducted by aliens. And we're talking about the aliens in flying saucers, spaceships, UFOs. And our first report comes from the Nashua Telegraph, dated the 18th of November, 1992. So almost 30 years ago. United by the unusual. Milford Man leads a network for people who say they have seen UFOs or been abducted by aliens. By Paul Denucci, Telegraph Staff. To most middle-aged folks, the people who seek out Walter Friesendorf's group might seem pretty odd, like those who claim to have been abducted by aliens and subjected to strange experiments. They turn to Friesendorf because he is one of the few who will listen. Friesendorf, a Milford resident, is the Assistant State Director of Mutual UFO Network, Inc., a national group that investigates alleged sightings of unidentified flying objects and purported cases of alien abductions. Friesendorf, 50, says he has investigated about a dozen alleged abductions in the state, including some in Nashua, Londonderry, and Petersburg. Most of them, Friesendorf says, are valid. There are some people who will tell you about what happened to them, and then they don't want to talk to you anymore, Friesendorf recalls. They just want to unburden themselves. One Nashua woman kept a diary of her alleged alien encounters, Friesendorf says. She went through this for years, even since she was a little girl. He tries to get the people help, including channeling them to support groups, in which there are others who claim to have been abducted by aliens. Friesendorf acknowledges there are plenty of skeptics out there. One such doubter is Philip J. Klass, a contributing editor of Aviation Week magazine, who also publishes a newsletter discounting UFO phenomenon. Klass goes further than just debunking UFOs, saying that belief in alien abductions has become a dangerous cult, and suggests that believers seem to walk a line bordering on obsession. Klass said that they have developed their own dogma regarding abductions. If you believe it, they have chosen you for experiments, and they will come back for you. They will get you no matter where you are. The dogma is that they have selected you for genetic experiments. They will even abduct your children. If you have a daughter, they will impregnate her with alien sperm. Klass says he knows of MUFON and has attended its annual conferences. People who are members of MUFON are generally well-intentioned. They are sincere in their hearts that there are alien spacecraft out there. Klass says, I have spent 26 years investigating UFOs and have yet to find one. Friesendorf said he doesn't listen to the debunkers. He's a debunker, and that's his job. It's not a cult, and I don't understand how he says it is dangerous. Friesendorf says that Klass ought to talk to Dr. John Mack, a Harvard University psychiatrist who has studied people who claim to have been abducted. Mack concluded that the abductees he studied are not mentally ill. We are not saying the experiments are real or not. We're just saying these people are not crazy, said Pam Casey, a research assistant for Dr. Mack. We have been studying them for 2.5 years. Friesendorf says mentally unstable people have phoned him and claim to have encountered UFOs. They are typically schizophrenics and are obsessed that they are being followed, Friesendorf says, adding that they can easily be detected. But those cases from mentally ill people are rare compared to the ones that appear legitimate, he says. What particularly fascinates Friesendorf is the consistency in their stories. Alleged abductees describe encountering similar little grey people and undergoing similar experiments that leave the same types of physical scars, Friesendorf says. Friesendorf, an unemployed photographer, has held a fascination for the topic of UFOs since he was a teenager. He says he even has encountered a few unidentified flying objects himself. One such encounter occurred in Hollis along Route 122 in the early 1980s. At the time, Friesendorf and a friend were in a car when they saw an object with strobe lights floating noiselessly at treetop level, Friesendorf recounts. They watched it for a brief time before it disappeared. They never discovered the origin of the strange lights. In 1982, soon after that sighting, Friesendorf attended a state conference of MUFON, Inc., and discovered there were others like him who had similar experiences. The director offered him a position of assistant director, and Friesendorf gladly accepted. Since then, he has investigated countless cases of sightings and alleged abductions. He is now investigating a Wilton case that allegedly occurred in August. Two families claim that while in the backyard, they saw strange lights, and one young boy in the family even claims to have seen an alien eyeing them from the bushes. But even Friesendorf says, I have my suspicions about the boy's alleged observation. Friesendorf declined to name the family because he says he wants to maintain confidentiality. On December the 1st, at Milford's Watley Library, Friesendorf plans to have a slide presentation about UFOs and abductions. From that, he says, he expects others will come forward with information about UFO sightings and even abductions. And the accompanying photograph is of Walter Friesendorf himself, gazing towards the heavens, and the caption reads, Walter Friesendorf keeps an eye on the sky for reports of unidentified flying objects. Now again, this story comes from 1992, so Walter Friesendorf would be, if he's still with us, he'd be about 80 years old now. And it's interesting, the accounts of people agreeing that they're little grey aliens and having similar experiences. And of course, we later found out that was largely due to them talking to each other and feeding off each other's stories and embellishing each other. And falling back on the stereotypical little green or grey alien with the large head and the big eyes from fiction, from movies and so on. And our next item comes from the Chronicle Telegram, and this seems to be from the great state of Ohio. From the 27th of June, 2019, so not so long ago, and this is a story by Gillian Brockwell, The Washington Post, so it's a syndicated piece. And the headline is, Site of UFO Abduction Gets Historical Marker. And the word abduction is in inverted commas. What is certain about the night of October 11, 1973, is this. When Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker Jr. arrived at the Sheriff's Department in Pascagoula, Mississippi, they were frantic. They told authorities they had just been abducted by aliens. Each had a puncture wound in one arm. Police tried to catch them in a lie, but it didn't work. Both men later passed polygraph tests. Well, there you go. On Saturday, the riverbank where the men said the close encounter happened got a historical marker, calling it one of the, quote, best documented, end quote, cases of alien abduction. After decades of avoiding media attention, Parker was there for the dedication. Hickson died in 2011. In 1973, Hickson was Parker's foreman at a shipyard. The two had gone fishing after work at an abandoned boat launch and were still there after the sun went down. I was just getting ready to get some more bait, Hickson told the Washington Post in 1975, when I heard a kind of zipping sound. I looked up and saw a blue flashing light. Calvin turned around too. We saw a 30-foot-long object with a little dome on top. As it hovered just above the ground, 3 small creatures emerged, also hovering, he said. The men were suddenly paralyzed. The creatures grabbed them with pincer-type claws and pulled them towards the object, he says. I floated inside, Parker told the Biloxi Sun-Herald in 2018. Hickson said they were subjected to a physical examination by something that looked like a, quote, big eye, end quote, a constant mechanical sound buzzing the whole time. And then they were dropped off, right back in the dark delta where they started. Hickson found Parker standing up, arms raised to the sky, and screaming, he told the Post. They ran for help. At first, sheriff's investigators thought the men had just been drunk, or lying. After interviewing the men, they left the room with a recorder secretly taping, hoping to catch the pair dropping the act once they left. But they didn't. They kept on talking about what they had seen and how scared they were. We did everything we knew to try and break their stories, Jackson County Sheriff's Captain Glenn Ryder told the Post in 1975. If they were lying to me, they should be in Hollywood. Overnight, it was national news. There were news conferences and cameras thrust in their still stunned faces. A, quote, UFO investigator, end quote, from Northwestern University flew down and said their story checked out. Skeptics called them liars, or said Hickson had an episode of sleep paralysis with hypnagogic hallucinations, while Parker was just, quote, highly suggestible, end quote. Now I'll stop here quickly to say some of that makes sense. Now the line here that says skeptics called them liars, well, which skeptics? We'd like to know. Exactly who? Just people in the street who didn't think their story checked out, or official skeptics, or someone like Joe Nickel? It's very easy to just say skeptics say this or skeptics say that. We read on. Believers flooded into Pascagoula by the thousands. wrapped in aluminium foil and sitting all night on the hoods of their cars, waiting for visitors from another world. Hickson was 42 at the time and was well known in the community, so perhaps he felt more able to handle the media crush. He recounted the experience to anyone who would listen. He went on Johnny Carson and Dick Cavett. He published a book in 1983. Parker, on the other hand, was 18 or 19 when it happened. He had just arrived in Pascagoula from an even smaller town and had planned to earn some extra money before returning home to get married. He told the media he had passed out at the beginning of the whole affair and couldn't remember what happened. That was the only lie he told, he said to the Sun-Herald in 2018. In fact, he did remember what happened, and was so afraid that aliens had infected him with something that when he got home from the sheriff's department, he took a bath in bleach. Within a few weeks, he skipped town. He got married and picked up some work in oil fields. If someone at a job recognized him, he would quit. If Hickson was trying to get rich from the story, it didn't work. Parker told the Sun-Herald that before Hickson's death in 2011, he occasionally paid the older man's electric bill. Parker, now in his 60s, slowly came out of hiding in recent years, and in 2018 published a book of his own. In March, as the city was discussing plans for the marker, new witnesses emerged, telling the Mississippi Clarion Ledger that on the night in question they saw an unidentified flying object with flashing blue lights going up and down the Pascagoula River. They said they kept it a secret all these years because they were afraid of people's reactions. One of them, Maria Blair, told the Clarion Ledger, "The story is very true. That's what has bothered me for 45 years. It's been on my mind for 45 years. And believe it or not, a quick search around the internet, and I found quite a lot to do with Calvin Parker and the UFOs and Mr. Hickson. And so we have part of a news report here from 1975.
Something happened October of 73 that would go down in history. The spaceship came with many blue lights set down near them in the night. 3 little men came out and took him inside. They looked him over with one big eye. They say what they saw was the real thing, though. They were the ones that saw the Pascagoula UFO.
Last October, in the quiet Mississippi town of Pascagoula, 2 local men confronted authorities with a rather bizarre story. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker told of a strange craft landing near their fishing site and of being taken aboard by 3 unearthly creatures. The 2 men were questioned under hypnosis and lie detectors, but their story remained intact. One of the men suffered a nervous breakdown and is still under treatment.
I guess that was when I heard it. It was some kind of zipping sound. And when I turned around in this area out here, about 40 or 50 feet out there, there was some kind of craft, you know. It looked like it's going to come right onto the ground. But it came on down and hovered about a 1.5 feet or 2 feet off of the ground. But we didn't know what to do, you know. The river behind us and that out there, not knowing what it was. So, and then before we had time to really do anything, it seemed like an opening appeared. Toward the end, it was, you know, toward us. And the blue light, it had blue flashing lights as it was, you know, approaching the ground, but then they went out. And when the opening appeared, some source of light came from the inside. It was just almost blinding.
Sheriff Diamond, can you tell me just what happened that night?
No, sir, I can't. All I can tell you is there was 2 men came into the sheriff's department approximately 8:30 and 9 o'clock. They were all excited, upset, wanting to climb the walls, hysterical, crying. That's actually all I know is what happened. I mean, as far as me seeing what happened, I don't know.
73 that would go down in history. The spaceship came with many blue lights set down near them.
Well, there you are. Stories from the past about alien abductions. You don't hear about it much anymore, I must say. I think the fad has come and gone. Or maybe I don't move in the right circles. Maybe there are still people who meet regularly and discuss their experiences flying around in UFOs or being experimented upon or something like that. But it does seem to me that it is a bit of a artifact from years gone by.
Sit down near them in the night.
Whatever the case, it does make for interesting reading and research. And you too can find lots of interesting reading and research to your heart's content by visiting Trove at trove.nla.gov.au or your local online resource for newspapers in your part of the world because, as the aliens say, you never know what you might find.
Sit down near them in the night. Three little men came out and took him inside. They looked him over with one big eye.
Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast, and thank you, as ever, to those wonderful people who contribute to the Skeptic Zone via PayPal or Patreon at skepticzone.tv. Your contributions mean the show keeps going, and as I think I mentioned last week or the week before, I'm using a new bit of gear, a new bit of kit, which was generously donated by one of my listeners. Thank you very much. Coming up on next week's show, apart from I think a tribute to my friend Jim with some skeptical poetry, the Trove segment is going to be looking at pyramid power. So if you have any dull razor blades or you want your food dehydrated, tune in to the show next week. Also coming up on next week's episode, we have an interview with my old mate Ben Radford. He's going to be talking about his new book, America the Fearful. And part two of the Book of Tim segment about Perpetual Motion. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.
Hi, my name used to be Tim Mendham.
What is it now?
Hey, you. Hi, my name's Tim Mendham. What am I? Good question. Okay.